Close your eyes if you'd like. Let your breathing slow, natural, and easy. Feel yourself sinking deeper into whatever comfort surrounds you. Tonight, we're going on a journey across wine-dark seas, beneath crashing waves, into the very heart of the ocean, where one of the most powerful and temperamental gods in all of Greek mythology holds court. His name reverberates through ancient texts like thunder rolling across water. Poseidon, the Earthshaker, lord of the seas, creator of horses, wielder of the mighty trident. The ancient Greeks both revered and feared him, for he was as unpredictable as the ocean itself. One moment calm and bountiful, the next moment violent and devastating. His rage could shake the very foundations of the earth. His favor could ensure safe passage across treacherous waters. Tonight, we'll explore his secrets, his creations, his terrible vengeance, and his immense power on Mount Olympus. So settle in, let the rhythm of imagined waves wash over you, and prepare to meet the god who ruled everything the ancient world depended upon to survive. There's no rush. The tides wait for no one, but tonight, the story of Poseidon will unfold at its own pace, as vast and deep as the ocean itself. The Trembling ruler. Understanding Poseidon's power and importance. Before we dive into the myths and legends surrounding Poseidon, we need to understand just how monumentally important this god was to the ancient Greeks. This wasn't just another deity in a crowded pantheon of colorful characters. Poseidon was one of the big three, the three most powerful Olympian gods, who, after overthrowing the Titans, divided the entire cosmos between themselves. Zeus claimed the sky and became king of the gods. Hades took the underworld and became lord of the dead. And Poseidon? He received dominion over all the waters of the earth, the vast oceans, the churning seas, the rivers that sustained civilization, and even the springs that bubbled up from beneath the ground. For a civilization like ancient Greece, which was fundamentally maritime in nature, Poseidon's importance cannot be overstated. Greece is a land of islands and peninsulas, of rocky coastlines and natural harbors. The ancient Greeks weren't just surrounded by water. They lived on it, traveled across it, traded upon it, and fought their wars on it. Every aspect of Greek life was connected to the sea. Food came from fishing. Wealth came from maritime trade. Communication between city-states depended on ships. Military power was measured in triremes, the warships that would decide the fate of empires. And all of this, every voyage, every catch of fish, every trade mission, every naval battle, was ultimately at the mercy of Poseidon. Think about that for a moment. Imagine living in a time before weather forecasting, before understanding ocean currents or storm patterns, before GPS or radio communication. When you set out on a ship across the Mediterranean or the Aegean, you were genuinely at the mercy of forces you couldn't predict or control. A sudden storm could sink your vessel. Unfavorable winds could leave you stranded at sea. Massive waves could smash your ship against rocks. And the ancient Greeks, in trying to make sense of these terrifying and unpredictable forces, personified them as Poseidon, a god whose temperament was as changeable as the sea itself. The ancient sources consistently describe Poseidon as powerful, temperamental, moody, easily offended, and absolutely terrible when angered. Homer, in the Iliad, describes him as being equal to Zeus in dignity, but weaker in power, though Poseidon himself seems to disagree with this assessment and occasionally challenges Zeus's authority. The god's personality was understood to mirror the sea, sometimes calm and generous, providing safe passage and bountiful catches. Other times violent and destructive, sending storms that could destroy entire fleets and earthquakes that could level cities. This earthquake association is crucial to understanding Poseidon. He wasn't just the god of the sea, he was the earth shaker, the god who could strike the ground with his trident and cause the very earth to split open. Greece, sitting as it does on multiple fault lines, experienced frequent and devastating earthquakes. The ancient Greeks had no concept of plate tectonics or seismic activity. What they saw was the ground suddenly and violently shaking without warning, buildings collapsing, fissures opening in the earth, sometimes entire cities being destroyed in moments. This terrifying phenomenon was attributed to Poseidon, whose power wasn't limited to the waters, but extended beneath the earth itself. Ancient Greek natural philosophers tried to explain this connection rationally. Thales, Anaximenes, and Aristotle all theorized that earthquakes were caused by underground waters eroding rocks, which aligned with folk beliefs about Poseidon. The Greeks observed rivers in the Peloponnese disappearing into the earth, and then bursting out again elsewhere. They saw the erosion of coastlines by waves. They connected these observations to the concept of water as a fundamental force beneath the earth's surface, and Poseidon, as the god controlling these subterranean waters, became logically the god of earthquakes as well. His epithets reflected these various aspects of his power. He was called Enosichthon and Enosigaios, both meaning earthshaker. He was Gaeochos, the earth holder or earth supporter. He was Seisichthon, again referencing his seismic power. But interestingly, he was also invoked with protective epithets. Asphaleos, meaning securer or protector, and Demeliushos, meaning foundation supporter or upholder of the foundations. This reveals something profound about Greek religious thought. The same god who could cause earthquakes was also the one you prayed to for protection from them. Poseidon wasn't simply destructive. He was the force that needed to be kept favorable, the power that needed to be respected and honored to avoid catastrophe. The name Poseidon itself reveals his ancient importance. Scholars have debated its etymology for centuries, but most agree it contains an element meaning husband or lord, and another element possibly meaning earth, making him something like Lord of the Earth or Husband of the Earth. This connects him to Demeter, whose name means Earth Mother, and suggests Poseidon may have originally been an earth and fertility god before becoming more strongly associated with the sea. Indeed, in isolated Arcadia, an inland region of Greece, Poseidon was worshipped as a horse god, and in connection with Demeter and Persephone, with distinctly chthonic underground associations. This horse connection is another crucial aspect of Poseidon's identity, and one we'll explore in detail later. Poseidon was credited with creating horses, and he was often called Hippios, meaning of horses, or depicted with horse imagery. The ancient Greeks saw a connection between horses and water. Both were powerful, swift, and somewhat wild and uncontrollable. Springs created by Poseidon striking his trident into the ground were sometimes called horse springs, and the Greek words for horses and springs shared linguistic roots. In ancient Greek art, Poseidon cuts an impressive figure. He's typically portrayed as a mature, powerful man, with a full beard, often with a muscular build that conveys strength and virility. His expression can be calm or fierce, depending on the context. Unlike Zeus, who is often shown in a state of majestic repose, Poseidon is frequently depicted in motion, his robes billowing, his trident raised, his face showing emotion. This visual language communicated his volatile nature, the fact that he was, as Homer said, not characterized by majestic calm like his brother Zeus, but rather by a state that could change rapidly from tranquility to violent agitation. The most famous and iconic image of Poseidon that survives is the bronze statue discovered in the sea off Cape Artemision, dating to around 460 BCE, though some scholars debate whether it depicts Poseidon or Zeus. Most believe it's Poseidon. The statue shows a powerful nude male figure with his arm drawn back, preparing to hurl his weapon. In Poseidon's case, his trident. The figure radiates controlled power and focused intensity. His beard is full, his body idealized but mature, his stance dynamic. This statue captures something essential about Poseidon. He's not passive or distant. He's engaged, active, ready to unleash his power. That power made Poseidon one of the most widely worshipped gods in ancient Greece, particularly in coastal cities and islands. Every Greek city with access to the sea needed Poseidon's favor. Sailors made sacrifices before voyages. Fishermen prayed for good catches and safe returns. Coastal communities built temples overlooking the water where the god could symbolically watch over the harbors and shores. The famous Temple of Poseidon at Cape Sunion, perched on a cliff above the Aegean Sea, served as both a place of worship and a landmark for sailors. Seeing the temple meant you were nearing Athenian waters, and many sailors would have whispered prayers of thanks to Poseidon for safe passage as the temple came into view. The Isthmian Games, held near Corinth every 2 years, were dedicated to Poseidon and rivaled the Olympic Games in prestige. These athletic competitions included chariot racing, fitting for the god of horses, as well as other contests. Winners were crowned with wreaths of wild celery, a plant sacred to Poseidon. The games were more than just sport. They were a religious festival celebrating the god and seeking his continued favor. But Poseidon's worship wasn't just about seeking benefits. It was also about appeasing a god known for his terrible temper and his willingness to hold grudges. When Poseidon was offended, and he was easily offended, his vengeance could be swift and devastating. We'll see this repeatedly in his myths. Cities destroyed by sea monsters. Heroes cursed to wander for years. Entire fleets destroyed by storms. Poseidon, unlike some of the more aloof or philosophical deities, was emotionally volatile. He took things personally. He remembered insults, and he had the power to make those who wronged him regret it profoundly. This combination, immense power, volatile temperament, and absolute control over something the Greeks desperately needed, the sea, and greatly feared, earthquakes, made Poseidon a god who commanded both reverence and genuine terror. You honored Poseidon not out of pure love or abstract piety, but out of very practical, survival-oriented fear and respect. The sea could feed you or kill you. The ground beneath your feet could support you or swallow you. And all of it answered to one god whose moods were as unpredictable as the waves. As we explore Poseidon's stories, keep this context in mind. Every myth involving Poseidon carries this undercurrent of danger, this awareness that we're dealing with elemental forces personified. When Poseidon rages, the earth shakes. When Poseidon pursues revenge, years of suffering follow. When Poseidon creates, the results are often as terrible as they are magnificent. He is, in every sense, a god of extremes, of tremendous creative power and terrible destructive wrath, of calm seas and devastating storms, of gifts to humanity and curses that last generations. He is, in short, exactly what you would expect from a god who embodies the ocean itself. Beautiful, powerful, necessary for life, and absolutely, utterly dangerous. If you hear about birth, family, and the cosmic division of power, to understand Poseidon's place in the divine hierarchy, we need to go back to the beginning. Not his beginning specifically, but the beginning of the Olympian order itself, like his brothers Zeus and Hades, and his sisters Hera, Demeter, and Hestia. Poseidon's story begins with violence, betrayal, and the overthrow of a previous generation of gods. Poseidon's parents were Cronus and Rhea, the king and queen of the Titans. Cronus himself had come to power by castrating his own father, Uranus, the personification of the sky, in a brutal act of rebellion orchestrated by Gaia, the earth. But Cronus, paranoid and tyrannical, lived in fear of a prophecy that warned him he would be overthrown by his own children, just as he had overthrown his father. When Rhea began bearing children, Cronus made a horrifying decision. He would swallow each child whole immediately after birth, preventing them from ever growing powerful enough to threaten him. So, one by one, Cronus swallowed his children. First came Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera. Each daughter was taken from Rhea's arms and consumed by their father. Then came the sons. Hades, the first-born son, was swallowed. Then came Poseidon. Imagine Rhea's anguish and horror, watching her husband devour 5 of her children, knowing they were immortal gods who would continue to exist inside their father's belly, conscious and trapped, but unable to die. Different ancient sources give slightly different birth orders, but most agree that Poseidon was the second son, swallowed shortly after Hades. Now here's where the story gets interesting. The children didn't die inside Cronus. They couldn't, being immortal, but they did continue to mature somehow. This creates a strange paradox that Greek mythology simply accepts without explanation. When these gods were eventually freed, they emerged as fully grown adults despite never having experienced childhood in the normal sense. They had been trapped in their father's body, but they had somehow grown to maturity anyway. When Rhea became pregnant for the 6th time, she knew she couldn't bear to lose another child. She went to her parents, Gaia and Uranus, seeking help and advice. Together, they devised a plan. When the time came for the birth, Rhea gave birth in secret to her 6th child, Zeus, and hid him on the island of Crete. There, in a cave on Mount Ida or Mount Dicte, sources vary, Zeus was raised by nymphs and protected by the Curetes, who clashed their spears against their shields to mask the baby's cries. Meanwhile, Rhea wrapped a large stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Cronus, who, in his paranoia and haste, swallowed it without examining it closely. Zeus grew to adulthood in hiding, safe from his father's awareness. When he reached maturity and his full divine power, he knew it was time to fulfill the prophecy and free his siblings. The exact method varies by source, but the core story is consistent. Zeus, with help from various allies, managed to force Cronus to regurgitate all the children he had swallowed. In some versions, Zeus disguised himself as a cupbearer and gave Cronus a potion that made him vomit up everything he'd swallowed. In other versions, Zeus simply used his divine power to force the disgorging. One by one, the swallowed gods emerged from their father: Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, in reverse order from how they had been swallowed. Poseidon, who had been the second to be swallowed, was thus the second to last to emerge, followed only by Hestia. Each emerged as a fully formed adult god ready for battle. This was both a rescue and a call to war. The newly freed gods weren't content to simply be free. They wanted revenge on their father and the titans who had supported his tyranny. But they were outnumbered and, initially, less experienced in warfare than the titans. The siblings needed allies and weapons. They found both by freeing other prisoners of the old regime. First, they freed the Cyclopes, 3 one-eyed giants who were master craftsmen and who had been imprisoned by Cronus, just as they had been imprisoned earlier by Uranus. In gratitude for their freedom, the Cyclopes forged 3 mighty weapons for the 3 brothers. For Zeus, they created the Thunderbolt, that devastating weapon that could strike down even immortals, and that would become Zeus's signature attribute. For Hades, they forged the Helm of Darkness, or Helm of Invisibility, which rendered its wearer completely undetectable. And for Poseidon, they crafted the Trident, a 3-pronged spear that would become synonymous with the god of the sea. The trident wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of Poseidon's dominion, and a tool through which he could channel his divine power. With it, he could strike the earth and cause earthquakes. He could strike rocks and cause springs of fresh or salt water to burst forth. He could steer the seas into violent storms, or calm them to glassy smoothness. He could shatter stone and split mountains. The trident represented Poseidon's power over water, earth, and the boundary between them. Some scholars believe the trident originated as an actual tool, a 3-pronged fishing spear used to catch eels or large fish, that was then elevated to divine status and invested with cosmic significance. The young gods also freed the Hecatoncheires, 3 giants with 100 hands each and 50 heads apiece, who had also been imprisoned. These beings were immensely powerful and became crucial allies in the war to come, the war between the Olympians, as Zeus and his siblings would come to be known after Mount Olympus became their seat of power, and the Titans is called the Titanomachy, and it lasted 10 years. The battles were cosmic in scale. Mountains were hurled as weapons. The earth shook, the seas boiled, the sky burned. Poseidon, wielding his new trident, proved himself a formidable warrior. His control over water gave him devastating tactical advantages, and his ability to cause earthquakes meant he could literally undermine the Titans' positions. Hades, wearing his helm of invisibility, could strike without being seen, spreading fear and confusion. Zeus wielded the Thunderbolt, the most powerful weapon in the conflict. The Hecatoncheires, with their 100 hands, could hurl boulders like rain. The sheer violence and chaos of this war shaped the very landscape of the mythological world. Eventually, after a decade of conflict, the Olympians prevailed. The Titans were defeated, and Zeus ordered them imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest pit beneath even the underworld, where they would be guarded by the Hecatoncheires to ensure they never threatened the new order again. Now came the question: how would the victors divide the world they had conquered? The cosmos was vast, containing the sky above, the earth in the middle, the seas surrounding the earth, and the underworld beneath it all. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades were the three brothers, the three most powerful of the Olympians, and it was clear they would be the primary rulers. But who would rule what? According to Homer in the Iliad, our earliest and most authoritative source for this, they decided to draw lots, leaving the decision to fate rather than fighting among themselves, after having just finished a 10-year war. It's worth noting that this decision shows a certain wisdom. They were exhausted. They'd just overthrown a tyrannical father. The last thing they needed was to turn on each other over territory. Drawing lots was a way to divide power that no one could argue with. Fate had decided. Zeus drew the sky, the heavens, the realm of clouds and storms and lightning. This gave him the high ground, literally and figuratively. He would become the king of the gods, ruling from Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece. Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, the vast kingdom beneath the earth where all mortal souls would eventually come. And Poseidon drew the seas, all the oceans and waters of the world, making him lord of a domain as vast as Zeus's sky and as important as Hades' underworld. The earth itself and Mount Olympus were considered common ground, accessible to all three brothers. Though Zeus's palace on Olympus gave him a kind of primacy, this division created an interesting dynamic. Zeus was nominally in charge as king of the gods, but each brother ruled his own domain absolutely. Poseidon wasn't subordinate to Zeus when it came to the seas. Hades wasn't answerable to Zeus regarding the underworld. This would create tensions, particularly between Zeus and Poseidon, as we'll see. Some sources suggest Poseidon wasn't entirely happy with his lot. The sea was powerful, yes, but it was also somewhat remote from the center of divine politics and activity on Mount Olympus. Poseidon had his underwater palace near Aegae in Euboea, described in Homer as a magnificent structure where he kept his horses with bronze hooves and golden manes. But he seems to have spent considerable time on Olympus as well, more so than Hades, who largely remained in his underworld kingdom. Poseidon wanted to be involved, to have influence, to be recognized as equal or possibly superior to Zeus. This desire for recognition and power shows itself repeatedly in Poseidon's mythology. He challenged Zeus in various ways. He competed for patronage of cities, most famously Athens, as we'll explore later. He sided with the Greeks in the Trojan War, even when Zeus favored the Trojans. At one point, according to Homer, Poseidon even participated in a conspiracy with Hera and Athena to overthrow Zeus and bind him in chains. The plot only failed because the Nereid Thetis summoned one of the Hecatonchires to free Zeus before the conspiring gods could finalize their coup. Poseidon's relationship with Zeus was complex and often contentious. In the Iliad, there's a remarkable scene where Zeus sends his messenger Iris to command Poseidon to stop helping the Greeks and withdraw from the battlefield. Poseidon's response is revealing. He says, essentially, that he's Zeus's equal in dignity and honor, that they divided the world by lot as brothers of equal status, and that Zeus has no right to order him around like a subordinate. He acknowledges that Zeus is more powerful. Zeus has the thunderbolt after all, but Poseidon clearly resents any implication that he's inferior or that Zeus can command him. This tension between the brothers runs throughout Greek mythology. Poseidon had a temper. Zeus had authority. The two occasionally clashed, but open warfare between them never erupted. probably because both understood that such a conflict would be devastating, and because, despite their tensions, they were family and had fought together to establish the Olympian order. Poseidon's relationship with Hades was less contentious. They had less reason to compete. Their domains barely overlapped. Hades stayed in the underworld, focused on his duties there. Poseidon roamed the seas and spent time on Olympus. They respected each other's space. When Poseidon needed to travel to or through the underworld, which happened occasionally in various myths, Hades apparently didn't object, and the two seemed to have a more cordial, if distant, relationship than either had with Zeus. With his sisters, Poseidon's relationships were mixed. He would later assault Demeter, pursuing her relentlessly, even when she tried to escape by transforming into a mare, whereupon Poseidon transformed into a stallion and had his way with her anyway, resulting in the birth of the horse Arion and the goddess Despoina. His relationship with Hera was formal and distant, with Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, who kept largely to herself. There's barely any mythological interaction recorded. The drawing of lots and division of the cosmos wasn't just a mythological story about how the world came to be ruled. It was also a political statement about power, legitimacy, and the divine order. The Olympians had overthrown their father not because they were angry at him, though they certainly were, but because his rule was tyrannical and unjust. The new order they established was supposed to be better, more fair, more rational, governed by law and fate rather than pure power. The fact that they drew lots rather than fighting over territory signaled this new approach. Zeus wasn't king simply because he was strongest, though he was, but because fate had chosen him, and his brothers had agreed to honor that choice. Of course, in practice, the Olympian order wasn't that different from what came before. Zeus was still often tyrannical. The gods still fought and schemed and betrayed each other. Poseidon still chafed under Zeus's nominal authority. But the ideal was there. The idea that even gods should respect fate, honor agreements, and maintain cosmic order. For Poseidon specifically, the division of the cosmos meant he gained immense power over an essential domain, but it also meant a certain isolation. The sea was vast, powerful, economically crucial, but it was also remote. Poseidon built his palace beneath the waves, far from Olympus. When he traveled, he rode in a chariot pulled by hippocampi, creatures that were half horse, half fish, across the ocean surface. The sea creatures recognized him and played around his chariot. The waves calmed as he approached. He was, in every sense, the undisputed lord of his domain. But he was also, perhaps, lonely. He sought mortal lovers, divine consorts, nymphs and goddesses, and human women far more frequently than Hades ever did. He involved himself in mortal affairs, competing for cities, fathering heroes, taking revenge on those who slighted him. He stayed close to Olympus, attending councils and involving himself in divine politics. Unlike Hades, who rarely left the underworld, Poseidon wanted to be part of things, to be recognized, to be honored and feared and respected. He was powerful, second only to Zeus, but he was also, in some deep way, insecure about his position, and constantly needed to assert his authority and remind everyone of his power. This combination, tremendous power, volatile temperament, desire for recognition, and willingness to hold grudges, would define Poseidon's character throughout Greek mythology. The god who emerged from Cronus's belly, who fought in the Titanomachy, who drew the seas as his portion, and who built his underwater palace, was a god of extremes who would leave an indelible mark on Greek myth and culture, for better and for worse. The Trident and the Earthshaker's terrible powers. Let's talk about power. Not the abstract, philosophical kind, but the raw, terrifying, world-shaking kind of power that made ancient Greeks whisper prayers before voyages and pour libations into the sea, hoping to appease the god who controlled forces that could destroy everything they knew in moments. The symbol of this power was the trident, Poseidon's three-pronged spear, forged by the Cyclopes during the Titanomachy, imbued with divine force and wielded with devastating effect. The trident wasn't merely a weapon. It was a conduit for Poseidon's will, an extension of his power, a tool through which he could manipulate the fundamental forces of water and earth. With a strike of his trident against the ocean surface, Poseidon could summon storms that would terrify even the bravest sailors. Waves would rise to the height of mountains. Winds would shriek like tortured souls. Lightning would split the sky while thunder rolled across the water. Ships would be tossed like toys, hulls cracking, masts snapping, sails shredding. Men would be swept overboard, screaming prayers to Poseidon even as the waves dragged them under. The god could maintain such storms for days, weeks even, pursuing a single vessel across thousands of miles of ocean, as we'll see when we examine his decade-long persecution of Odysseus. But the trident's power wasn't limited to water. When Poseidon struck his trident against the ground, whether that was the floor of the ocean, a rocky coastline, or the earth itself, the ground would shake. This is why the ancient Greeks called him Enosigaios and Enosishthon, the earth shaker. Earthquakes to the Greeks were manifestations of Poseidon's wrath, or sometimes simply his movements as he traveled through his underwater realm. Understanding how the Greeks conceptualized earthquakes helps us grasp why this power was attributed to Poseidon specifically. The ancient Greek philosophers and natural theorists observed that much of Greece was seismically active. They saw evidence of water's erosive power, rivers cutting through rock, coastlines being reshaped by waves, springs and underground waterways appearing and disappearing. They developed theories that underground waters eroded and destabilized rocks and earth, causing the ground above to shake and collapse. Since Poseidon was the god of all waters, including those beneath the earth, it made logical sense that he was responsible for earthquakes. The god of waters became the god of what those waters could do, which included undermining the very earth people lived on. This wasn't superstition masking ignorance. It was the best explanation available given their observations and their cosmological framework. The Greeks were trying to make sense of real phenomena that terrified them. When the ground suddenly shook without warning, when buildings collapsed and fissures opened in the earth, when entire cities could be destroyed in moments, they attributed this to Poseidon's power. And they weren't entirely wrong, at least metaphorically. Earthquakes are caused by forces beneath the Earth's surface, by movements of massive plates, by pressures building and releasing. The Greeks lacked the geological knowledge to understand the mechanism, but they correctly identified that earthquakes came from below, and they connected that to the god who ruled the underworld waters. Historical records from ancient Greece chronicle numerous devastating earthquakes attributed to Poseidon's anger. In 373 BCE, the city of Helike was destroyed by a massive earthquake and subsequent tsunami. The sea rushed in and swallowed the city entirely, turning it into a watery grave. Ancient sources explicitly attributed this to Poseidon's wrath over some offense the citizens had committed. In 226 BCE, the island of Rhodes was struck by an earthquake that destroyed the famous Colossus of Rhodes, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Again, this was interpreted as Poseidon's doing. In 141 or 142 CE during the Roman period, but in a region still steeped in Greek culture, an earthquake struck Lycia and Rhodes, affecting 28 ancient cities and causing a tsunami. Ancient Greeks and Romans saw Poseidon's angry hand in this disaster. When earthquakes struck, religious responses followed. Cities might send embassies to major temples of Poseidon, bearing gifts and sacrifices. New temples might be promised or existing ones renovated. Festivals might be instituted in the god's honor. All of this was aimed at appeasing Poseidon, at convincing him to calm down, at demonstrating proper respect and worship, so that his wrath might be turned aside. But Poseidon's trident could also create rather than destroy. When he struck rocks with it, springs of water would burst forth. Sometimes these were springs of fresh water, tremendously valuable in the arid Mediterranean climate. Other times they were springs of salt water, which had symbolic value even if they couldn't be drunk. The most famous example of this was when Poseidon competed with Athena for patronage of Athens, which we'll explore in detail later. But the motif appears repeatedly in Greek mythology. Poseidon strikes the ground and water springs forth, demonstrating his power over the earth's hidden waters. He could also use his trident to split rocks, to open chasms in the earth, to anchor islands to the sea floor. In one myth, he anchors the floating island of Delos with his trident, stabilizing it so that it could be inhabited. The trident was a tool of creation and destruction, capable of reshaping the landscape itself, of altering coastlines and creating new islands, of bringing forth springs where there had been dry land. In Homer's descriptions, when Poseidon traveled, the sea itself responded to his presence. The waters would become smooth and calm before his chariot. Marine creatures, dolphins, fish, sea monsters of various kinds, would recognize their lord and play around his chariot in a kind of joyful greeting. Even the monsters of the deep, the terrible creatures that sailors feared, would become docile and playful in Poseidon's presence, acknowledging his absolute dominion over them. This control over sea creatures extended to creating them. Various mythological sea monsters were said to be Poseidon's offspring, or creations. When he needed to punish someone, he might send a sea monster to ravage their coastline, destroying ships and killing people until proper restitution was made. We'll see this pattern several times. Poseidon is offended. Poseidon sends a sea monster. The monster terrorizes the region until either a hero kills it or the offending party makes amends. Poseidon's palace beneath the waves was described as a magnificent structure made of coral and precious gems, shining even in the ocean depths. There he kept his horses, not ordinary horses, but divine steeds with bronze hooves and golden manes that could pull his chariot across the water surface as easily as across land. These weren't the hippocampi, the fish-tailed horse creatures, but actual horses who could somehow travel on or through water. reflecting Poseidon's dual nature as god of both seas and horses. The speed at which Poseidon could travel was often emphasized in ancient texts. When he chose to move, he could cross vast distances almost instantaneously. In the Iliad, when he decides to help the Greeks, despite Zeus's prohibition, he travels from his underwater palace near Aegae to the battlefield at Troy in just 4 steps, 4 enormous strides that cover hundreds of miles. This godlike speed reinforced his power and his ability to be anywhere in his vast domain at any moment. No ship could outrun him. No island was beyond his reach. If you were on the water or near it, you were in Poseidon's domain, subject to his power and his whims. This brings us to a crucial aspect of Poseidon's power: its unpredictability. Zeus had his thunderbolt, yes, but Zeus's moods and decisions followed certain patterns. He valued hospitality, punished oathbreakers, protected supplicants, and generally enforced cosmic order, however imperfectly. You could predict, to some extent, what might anger Zeus. But Poseidon was as unpredictable as the sea. He might be calm and grant safe passage for no clear reason. He might suddenly explode in rage over a perceived slight that seemed minor. He held grudges for years, even decades. He could be generous one moment and vengeful the next. This unpredictability made him more frightening than Zeus in some ways. With Zeus, you knew the rules, even if you might not always succeed in following them. With Poseidon, there were no clear rules. You could do everything right, perform the proper sacrifices, show proper respect, follow all the protocols, and still find yourself at the mercy of a god who decided to send a storm because he was in a bad mood that day. The ancient Greeks tried to manage this unpredictability through constant reverence and worship. Sailors would pour libations into the sea before voyages. Wine or olive oil mixed with water, poured onto the waves as an offering to the god. They would sacrifice animals, often bulls, which were sacred to Poseidon, or horses. Coastal cities would maintain temples dedicated to Poseidon, with priests performing regular rituals to keep the god favorable. The Isthmian Games, held every 2 years at Corinth, were one of the 4 major Pan-Hellenic athletic festivals, and were entirely dedicated to Poseidon. Chariot races, foot races, combat sports, all performed in the god's honor, all aimed at keeping him pleased. But it was never enough to guarantee safety. The sea remained dangerous. Earthquakes still struck without warning, and everyone knew that Poseidon, despite all the honor and worship he received, could still choose to destroy rather than protect, to rage rather than to calm, to punish rather than to bless. This is the god we're dealing with. Not a benevolent protector, not a wise ruler, but a force of nature personified, beautiful and terrible, necessary and dangerous, generous and vengeful, creative and destructive, all at once. The trident wasn't just a symbol or a weapon. It was a warning. It represented power that could be turned in any direction at any moment, that answered to no one but Poseidon himself, that could not be reasoned with or controlled or predicted. The Earthshaker could shake your world, literally and figuratively, and there was nothing you could do except hope you hadn't offended him, and pray that today, right now, he chose to be calm rather than violent. This fundamental understanding that Poseidon's power was immense, crucial, and utterly beyond human control permeates every myth about him, shapes every interaction mortals have with him, and explains why, the ancient Greeks lived with a constant background fear of the god who ruled the seas and shook the earth. In a very real sense, their survival depended on staying in his good graces, and that was a terrifying position to be in, because his good graces were as changeable as the weather and as unpredictable as the waves. The contest for Athens and the creator of horses, one of the most famous myths involving Poseidon, is his competition with Athena for patronage of what would become one of the greatest cities in ancient Greece, Athens. This story reveals much about Poseidon's character, his competitiveness, his desire for recognition, his creativity, and his terrible response to rejection. It's also intimately connected to one of Poseidon's most important attributes, his role as creator and tamer of horses. The city that would become Athens was young, newly founded, and looking for a divine patron, a god or goddess who would protect it, bless it, and be honored there above all others in return. Both Poseidon and Athena wanted this honor. Both saw the potential in this small settlement that occupied a strategic position in Attica. Both knew that becoming patron of a city meant worship, sacrifices, festivals, temples, all the recognition and honor that deities valued. So they agreed to a contest. Each would present a gift to the city's inhabitants, and the people would choose which gift was more valuable. The winner would become the city's patron and give the city its name. Different ancient sources provide different details about this contest, but the core story remains consistent. King Cecrops, a mythical early ruler of the city, who was sometimes described as half man, half serpent, would serve as judge. Along with the assembled citizens, Poseidon went first. With tremendous force, Poseidon struck the Acropolis, the rocky outcrop that would later hold the Parthenon, with his mighty trident. The earth shook with the impact. Some sources say he struck the ground, and a spring burst forth, but this was a spring of salt water. Seawater brought forth from beneath the earth. Other versions of the myth say that from the spot where he struck, the first horse emerged, a magnificent creature unlike anything anyone had ever seen, powerful and swift, with flowing mane and thundering hooves. Or, in some tellings, he presented both, the spring and the horse, demonstrating his power over both water and this new form of animal life. The horse, if that's what he presented at Athens, was meant to be a practical gift with immediate military and economic value. Horses could pull chariots in warfare. They could pull plows in agriculture. They could carry riders across vast distances. They represented speed, power, and martial prowess. In a gift of horses, Poseidon was essentially offering the city the means to become powerful, to defend itself, to conquer others. It was a gift that spoke to ambition and strength. Now we need to pause here and explore Poseidon's relationship with horses more deeply, because it's central to his identity and appears repeatedly throughout Greek mythology. Poseidon was credited with creating the first horses, and the myths around this creation are varied and fascinating. One story says that Poseidon fell in love with the goddess Demeter, who was not interested in his advances. To escape him, Demeter transformed herself into a mare and hid among a herd of horses, hoping to avoid detection. But Poseidon, not to be deterred, transformed himself into a stallion and pursued her. He found her among the herd and, while in stallion form, mated with her. From this union came two offspring, a daughter named Despoina, who became a goddess worshipped in Arcadia, and a horse named Arion, a magnificent steed with the ability to speak and with a speed that surpassed all other horses. Arion would later be given to various heroes, including Heracles and Adrastus, and played roles in several mythic adventures. This story reveals something important about Poseidon. His desires weren't always welcome, and he was willing to use his power to get what he wanted. The story of his pursuit of Demeter is, by modern standards, clearly sexual assault, and it sets a pattern we'll see repeated. Poseidon sees, Poseidon wants, Poseidon takes. Another famous horse connected to Poseidon is Pegasus, the winged horse. This creature's origin story is both beautiful and horrific, involving one of Poseidon's most controversial affairs. Medusa, who would become one of the three Gorgons, monstrous women with snakes for hair whose gaze could turn people to stone, was originally a beautiful mortal woman and a priestess of Athena. Poseidon saw her, desired her, and, according to the Roman poet Ovid's account, raped her in Athena's temple itself, desecrating the sacred space. Athena, unable or unwilling to punish her uncle Poseidon, took out her rage on Medusa instead. She transformed the young woman into a Gorgon. Her beautiful hair became writhing snakes. Her lovely face became hideous, and anyone who looked directly at her would turn to stone. Medusa was exiled to a remote island, where she lived in isolation until the hero Perseus came to kill her as part of his quest. When Perseus beheaded Medusa, two creatures sprang from her neck. Chrysaor, a giant or hero wielding a golden sword, and Pegasus, the magnificent winged horse. Pegasus was thus, in a sense, Poseidon's offspring, born from his union with Medusa. The beautiful white horse with grand wings became one of the most iconic creatures in Greek mythology, later tamed by the hero Bellerophon and used in his adventures against the Chimera and other monsters. Poseidon also created the hippocampus, the creatures that pulled his chariot, which had the front half of a horse and the back half of a fish. These sea horses, as they're sometimes called, were perfectly adapted to their master's dual nature as god of both horses and seas. They could gallop across the waves and dive beneath them, equally at home on the surface or in the depths. The connection between horses and water runs deep in Greek thought. Both were powerful, swift, and somewhat wild and untamed. Both could be beneficial or dangerous. A horse could carry you swiftly to safety, or throw you and trample you. Water could quench your thirst or drown you. Horses were associated with springs and fountains. When Pegasus struck Mount Helicon with his hoof, a spring called Hippocrene, horse spring, burst forth, which became sacred to the Muses. The Greek words for horses, hippos, and springs shared linguistic connections, reinforcing this symbolic link. Poseidon, as Hippios, god of horses, was worshipped throughout Greece, but particularly in regions where horses were important for cavalry and chariot racing. Thessaly, known for breeding excellent horses, had strong Poseidon cult sites. The relationship between Poseidon and horses may actually predate his association with the sea. Some scholars think Poseidon was originally a horse god, who later became associated with the sea when Greeks became more maritime in orientation. But let's return to Athens and the contest. So Poseidon had presented his gift, whether a spring of salt water or a horse, or both, depending on which version we follow. The Athenians were impressed. This was clearly a display of divine power. But now it was Athena's turn. Athena approached the rocky ground of the Acropolis and knelt. She touched the earth gently, and from where she touched, a tree began to grow. Not just any tree, but an olive tree, quickly maturing before the watching crowd's eyes. She stood and presented her gift. This tree and all the olive trees that would descend from it, which she promised would grow throughout Attica. Now, on the surface, this might seem less impressive than Poseidon's gift. An olive tree versus a horse, a spring versus a tree. But the Athenians, practical people that they were, began to consider the real, long-term value of each gift. Poseidon's saltwater spring, while impressive, it couldn't be drunk. Athens was near the sea anyway. They had access to salt water. What they needed was fresh water, and Poseidon Spring wasn't that. As for the horse, yes, it was magnificent and useful, but it also represented war, conflict, and aggression. Horses needed to be fed and cared for. They were tools of battle. Athena's olive tree, on the other hand, represented multiple kinds of wealth and utility. The olives themselves were nutritious food. They could be pressed for olive oil, which had countless uses: cooking, lighting lamps, religious offerings, medicine, cosmetics. The wood of olive trees was valuable for construction and fuel. Olive cultivation represented peace, stability, agriculture, and long-term prosperity, rather than short-term military power. King Cecrops and the people deliberated and made their choice. They chose Athena's gift. The olive tree would be more beneficial to them than horses or salt water. Athena became the patron goddess of the city, which took her name, Athens. The olive tree she planted was said to stand on the Acropolis for centuries, with all olive trees in Attica considered to be descended from it. Some sacred olive trees, called Moriae, received special protection and were considered direct descendants of Athena's first olive. Poseidon's reaction to this rejection was exactly what you'd expect from the temperamental god. He was furious. How dare these mortals reject him, one of the three most powerful gods in the cosmos, in favor of his niece? How dare they choose a tree over the gifts of the sea god? In his rage, Poseidon flooded the Thriasian plain around Athens with salt water, ruining the agricultural land and causing hardship to the people. Some versions say he sent a drought instead, or perhaps both, flooding followed by drought, a 1-2 punch of divine vengeance. He made sure the Athenians would regret their decision, at least in the short term. But the decision stood. Athens would be Athena's city, and it would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, a center for philosophy, art, democracy, and naval power. Ironically, that naval power depended on the sea and thus, in a way, on Poseidon's domain. But Poseidon would never be the city's primary deity. He was honored there. He had his own temple on the Acropolis, the Erechtheion, which housed the marks of his trident, strike, and his saltwater spring. But he would always be secondary to Athena. This contest and its outcome set up a lasting rivalry between Poseidon and Athena. Throughout Greek mythology, they often find themselves on opposite sides of conflicts. During the Trojan War, both initially helped build Troy's walls, but later Poseidon sided with the Greeks, while Athena also sided with the Greeks, but for different reasons, and they worked independently rather than together. In the Odyssey, Athena protects and helps Odysseus, while Poseidon pursues him with implacable hatred for 10 years. The tension between them runs throughout Greek myth. The contest for Athens became one of the most popular subjects in Greek art. Temple friezes, pottery, sculptures, countless works depicted the moment of the contest, showing Poseidon with his trident striking the rock while Athena calmly presents her olive tree, with Cecrops and the Athenians watching. The west pediment of the Parthenon itself, the greatest temple in Athens, depicted this scene, proclaiming Athena's victory for all to see. For Poseidon, the contest for Athens represents a pattern that would repeat throughout his mythology. He desires something. He competes for it with displays of raw power. And sometimes he doesn't get what he wants, which then triggers his terrible rage and vengeance. His gifts were often impressive and powerful, but not always what recipients actually needed or wanted. His response to rejection was disproportionate and vindictive. He was powerful, certainly, but power alone didn't guarantee success or loyalty or love. The horse, whether or not it was his gift, in the contest for Athens, remained one of Poseidon's most important symbols and contributions to humanity. Horses played crucial roles throughout Greek civilization in warfare, transportation, agriculture, and sport. Chariot racing was one of the most prestigious competitions in athletic festivals, including the Olympic and Isthmian Games. Heroes rode horses into battle. Kings and wealthy citizens kept stables. The cavalry was an important military arm. All of this, the Greeks believed, came ultimately from Poseidon, who had created these magnificent creatures and taught humans how to tame them. Poseidon, as Hippios, the horse god, was invoked by charioteers and cavalry riders, by horse trainers and breeders, by anyone whose livelihood depended on horses. Sacrifices of horses to Poseidon weren't uncommon, though they were expensive offerings, reflecting the value of the animal being sacrificed. Sometimes horses were driven into the sea as an offering, drowning in Poseidon's domain as a way of returning his gift to him. The creation of horses, then, stands as one of Poseidon's most enduring legacies, a gift to humanity that, unlike his salt springs or his floods or his earthquakes, was unambiguously beneficial and that shaped Greek civilization profoundly. Whether he created them to impress Demeter or to compete for Athens, or simply because he could, the result was the same: a magnificent animal that combined power, grace, and utility, that was both wild and tameable, that connected humanity to the divine. In the horse, Poseidon created something that reflected his own nature: beautiful, powerful, useful, but always retaining an element of danger, always requiring respect and careful handling, always capable of throwing you off and trampling you if you weren't careful. The contest for Athens and the creation of horses reveal Poseidon at his most creative and his most petulant, displaying both his tremendous power and his vulnerability to rejection, both his ability to create wonders and his tendency to destroy it when he didn't get his way. These myths encapsulate the complexity and contradiction that define the god: immensely powerful, easily offended, generous and vengeful, creative and destructive, magnificent and terrifying all at once. Shock at Poseidon's rage, the Trojan War, and divine betrayal. If you want to understand Poseidon's capacity for grudges and his terrible vengeance when he felt betrayed, look no further than the story of Troy. This myth reveals Poseidon at his most petty, his most vindictive, and ultimately his most devastating, as his rage against a single king led to consequences that shaped one of the greatest wars in all of mythology. The story begins long before the Trojan War itself, back when Troy was just being established and needed proper defensive walls. The king at that time was Laomedon, father of Priam, who would later be king during the Trojan War. Laomedon wanted walls around his city that would be impregnable, legendary, something that would make Troy one of the greatest fortified cities in the world. In one of those divine punishments that Zeus seemed to enjoy doling out, Poseidon and Apollo found themselves temporarily stripped of their divine privileges and sent to serve a mortal king as punishment for a rebellion they'd participated in. Different sources give different reasons for this rebellion. Some say they joined Hera in an attempt to overthrow Zeus. Others say it was some other offense, but the result was the same. They were sent to Laomedon to serve him for a year. Now imagine being a mortal king and suddenly having two of the greatest Olympian gods available to work for you. Laomedon had the wisdom to put them to work on something significant, building walls around Troy. With Apollo's skill, he was associated with arts and crafts, and Poseidon's tremendous strength and power over Earth. They built walls that were truly legendary. Enormous stone blocks, perfectly fitted, impossibly strong. These were walls that were said to have been built by gods, and in this case, the saying was literally true. At the end of the year, when the walls were complete, Laomedon was supposed to pay Poseidon and Apollo for their labor. Different sources give different accounts of what the payment was supposed to be. Some say gold, others say his immortal horses, divine horses that Poseidon himself had given Laomedon's father. Others say something else. The exact payment almost doesn't matter. What matters is that Laomedon, looking at these two workers who had just finished their contract, made a catastrophic decision. He refused to pay them. Not only that, he actually threatened to sell them as slaves, showing complete contempt for agreements and basic honor, for gods who had been forced to work as mortals, serving beneath their dignity. This was an unforgivable insult. They had done the work. They had built magnificent walls, and now the mortal king was trying to cheat them and threaten them. Apollo and Poseidon both reacted with fury. Apollo sent a plague to ravage Troy, disease spreading through the city, killing the livestock and the people, showing his wrath through pestilence. Poseidon sent something worse, a sea monster. This wasn't just any creature. This was a massive beast that emerged from the sea and terrorized Troy's coastline. It destroyed ships, killed fishermen, devoured anyone who came near the water. It made the sea Troy's connection to trade and the outside world completely impassable and dangerous. The Trojans consulted oracles to find out how to stop these divine punishments. The answer came back. They needed to sacrifice Laomedon's daughter, Hesione, to the sea monster, chain her to the rocks by the shore, and let the beast take her. And maybe Poseidon's anger would be appeased. Imagine being Laomedon in this moment. His greed and dishonor had brought plague and sea monster to his city. His people were suffering, and now he had to choose between his daughter and his city. Different versions of the myth give different accounts of whether Laomedon actually went through with it. In some, Hesione was indeed chained to the rocks, only to be rescued at the last moment by the hero Heracles, who killed the sea monster. In others, Laomedon found some way to avoid the sacrifice, but still managed to end the immediate crisis. But Poseidon didn't forget. Gods don't forget. and especially not Poseidon, who nursed grudges like precious jewels, polishing them, keeping them bright and sharp for years or even decades. When the Trojan War finally broke out years later, with Laomedon long dead and his son Priam ruling Troy, Poseidon sided passionately with the Greeks. On the surface, this was about Paris abducting Helen, about the Greeks coming to retrieve her and restore their honor. But for Poseidon, this was also personal. This was the city that had betrayed him. These were the descendants of the king who had refused to pay him for building those magnificent walls. Walls that were now keeping the Greeks at bay. Walls that Poseidon himself had built. There's a delicious irony here. Poseidon's own work was being used against his allies, and he could do nothing about it directly. The walls he'd built were too good. They held for 10 years of siege, but Poseidon supported the Greeks in every other way he could. In the Iliad, Homer shows us Poseidon actively participating in the Trojan War on the Greek side. When Zeus fell asleep or was distracted, Poseidon would often take the opportunity to intervene directly. He would encourage the Greek warriors, sometimes taking the form of a Greek hero, to give them courage and fighting spirit. He would cause tremors beneath the Trojan lines, shaking their confidence. He worked to undermine Troy at every opportunity, still holding that grudge from generations before, still seeking revenge for Laomedon's betrayal. At one point, Zeus explicitly forbids the gods from interfering, wanting to let the war progress as fate dictates. Poseidon, characteristically, chafes against this restriction. He argues that he has as much right as Zeus to decide such matters, that they drew lots as equals, that the sea and earth are his domain, just as the sky is Zeus's. He's careful, though. He doesn't want to openly defy Zeus, who is more powerful and has that thunderbolt. But his resentment of Zeus's authority is clear. When Zeus does allow the gods to help whichever side they prefer, Poseidon enthusiastically joins the battle. In one memorable scene from the Iliad, Poseidon causes the earth to shake so violently that Hades, down in the underworld, fears the ceiling might crack and expose his realm to the sun. The Earthshaker uses his full power, and everyone, gods and mortals alike, feels it. Interestingly, when Poseidon encounters Apollo on the battlefield, Apollo supporting the Trojans, Poseidon supporting the Greeks, they hesitate to fight each other directly. Apollo, despite supporting Troy, apparently didn't hold the same grudge Laomedon's betrayal that Poseidon did. Poseidon feels he has more reason to hate Troy than Apollo does to love it, and he reminds Apollo of how Laomedon cheated them both. But Apollo declines to fight his uncle over mortal matters, and they separate without combat. This shows both restraint, gods avoiding family violence over mortal affairs, and Poseidon's continuing obsession with that ancient wrong. When Troy finally fell through the cleverness of Odysseus's Trojan horse, rather than through direct assault, Poseidon's revenge was complete. The city that had betrayed him was destroyed. King Priam was killed. Priam's sons were killed. The women were taken as slaves. Troy was looted and burned. The walls that Poseidon had built stood intact, ironically, but everything within them was destroyed. But Poseidon's involvement in the Trojan War didn't end with Troy's fall. The Greeks, in their victory, committed various offenses against the gods. The lesser Ajax raped Cassandra, a Trojan princess and priestess, in Athena's temple. the Greeks didn't properly punish him for this sacrilege. Other offenses were committed in the chaos of the sack of Troy. Poseidon, along with Athena, decided the Greeks needed to be punished for their impiety and arrogance in victory. So Poseidon turned his wrath on the victorious Greeks as they sailed home. He sent storms that scattered and destroyed much of the Greek fleet. Ships that had survived 10 years of war were smashed against rocks or sunk in violent seas. Thousands of Greeks who had survived the fighting at Troy drowned on the way home. This mass punishment of the Greek fleet became known as the returns, and it was brutal. Heroes who had fought bravely for a decade found themselves helpless against Poseidon's fury on the sea. This shows an important aspect of Poseidon's character. His sense of justice and honor, however twisted by his temperament, was real. He had supported the Greeks against Troy because Troy had wronged him. But when the Greeks then committed offenses against divine law, he turned on them without hesitation. His alliances were conditional. His support was contingent on proper behavior and respect. He didn't care about national loyalties or previous cooperation. He cared about being honored, being respected, and being paid what he was owed, whether that was physical payment for building walls or proper religious reverence from mortals. The Trojan War myths, from Laomedon's betrayal through the war itself to the punishment of the Greeks on their return journey, reveal Poseidon as a god who never forgot a slight, who pursued vengeance across generations, who could shift his alliances based on who showed him proper respect, and who had the power to make entire civilizations regret crossing him. When Poseidon held a grudge, nations fell. When he sent storms, fleets sank. When he sent sea monsters, heroes had to be summoned to fight them. The walls of Troy, standing testament to divine craftsmanship, became a symbol of divine betrayal and divine vengeance. Every stone in those walls carried the memory of Laomedon's greed, Apollo's plague, Poseidon's sea monster, and eventually the total destruction of the city that had dared to cheat the gods. These were walls built by a god and ultimately brought down, not through their own failure, but through the complete annihilation of everything within them, by that same god's unrelenting hatred. If there's a moral to this story, it's this: never ever cheat Poseidon. Pay your debts to him. Show him proper respect. Honor your agreements with him, because he will remember, he will wait, and when his moment comes, his revenge will be so complete and so devastating that the stories about it will be told for 3,000 years. The Odyssey, 10 years of vengeance against Odysseus. If the Trojan War showed Poseidon's wrath against a city and a people, the story of Odysseus shows Poseidon's vengeance against an individual, and how even the greatest hero, famous for his cunning and endurance, could be brought to his knees by a god who refused to forgive. The Odyssey, Homer's epic poem about Odysseus's 10-year journey home from Troy, is fundamentally a story about Poseidon's rage and punishment. While other gods, particularly Athena, help Odysseus, and while Odysseus's own character flaws contribute to his difficulties, the primary obstacle to his return is one god's implacable hatred, and the origin of that hatred is both tragically stupid on Odysseus's part and entirely characteristic of Poseidon's personality. After the fall of Troy, Odysseus and his men set sail for Ithaca, Odysseus's island kingdom, where his wife Penelope and son Telemachus waited. The journey should have taken weeks. It would take 10 years, and almost all of Odysseus's men would die before the end. The reason: Odysseus made the catastrophic mistake of offending Poseidon. Here's how it happened. During their journey, Odysseus and his crew landed on an island inhabited by the Cyclopes, a race of one-eyed giants who lived as primitive shepherds, ignorant of agriculture, social structures, or civilized customs. These creatures had no respect for the gods or for the Greek custom of xenia, hospitality toward strangers, which was sacred in Greek culture. Odysseus and some of his men entered a large cave, which turned out to belong to Polyphemus, one of the largest and most savage of the Cyclopes. When Polyphemus returned and found the Greeks in his cave, eating his cheese and food, he wasn't pleased. He trapped them inside by rolling a massive boulder across the entrance. A boulder so huge that even multiple men couldn't move it. Then he began eating Odysseus's men, 2 at a time, treating them as nothing more than snacks. Now, Odysseus was famous as the cleverest of all the Greek heroes. His intelligence and cunning had won the Trojan War with the wooden horse stratagem. Faced with this seemingly impossible situation, trapped in a cave with a man-eating giant, Odysseus devised a plan. First, he told Polyphemus that his name was Nobody, Audis in Greek. This seemed like a trivial lie, but Odysseus was setting up a trick. Then, Odysseus offered Polyphemus wine, extraordinarily strong wine, a gift from a priest of Apollo so potent it was normally mixed with 20 parts water before drinking. Polyphemus drank it straight, not knowing any better, and became thoroughly drunk, while the Cyclops slept in his wine-induced stupor. Odysseus and his men took a massive wooden stake, sharpened it, hardened the point in the fire, and drove it into Polyphemus's single eye, blinding him. The Cyclops' screams brought other Cyclopes running to his cave, asking what was wrong. "Nobody is killing me," Polyphemus shouted. "Nobody is hurting me." The other Cyclopes, hearing this, assumed he must be sick or mad, and they left, advising him to pray to his father Poseidon if nobody was hurting him. The next morning, Polyphemus, now blind, rolled the stone away to let his sheep out to pasture, feeling each sheep as it passed to make sure no men were escaping with them. But Odysseus had tied his men to the undersides of the sheep, 3 men to each large ram, with himself clinging to the belly of the largest ram. They escaped undetected, while Polyphemus could only feel wool passing by his hands. Now, here's where Odysseus should have just sailed away, grateful to have escaped alive. But Odysseus had a fatal flaw: his pride, his hubris. He couldn't resist taunting his victim. Once they were safely aboard their ship and pulling away from the shore, Odysseus shouted back at the blind Cyclops, mocking him, gloating about how he, Odysseus, had outwitted the mighty giant. Polyphemus hurled massive boulders at the sound of Odysseus's voice, nearly sinking the ship. Odysseus's men begged him to stop, to be quiet, to not antagonize the monster further. But Odysseus couldn't help himself. In his pride and anger at what had been done to his men, he shouted again, this time revealing his true identity. "Cyclops, if any mortal asks you who put out your eye, tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, who makes his home in Ithaca. This moment of vanity, this need to claim credit for his cleverness, this inability to escape quietly and anonymously, doomed Odysseus to a decade of suffering." Polyphemus, hearing the name of his tormentor, lifted his hands to the sky and prayed to his father. "Hear me, Poseidon, god of the sea. Earthshaker, blue-haired lord of the ocean. If I am truly your son, if you claim me as yours, grant that Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, never reaches his home. Or if he must reach home, let him arrive late in misery, having lost all his companions, sailing on a stranger's ship, and let him find trouble waiting in his house. This curse, born from Odysseus's hubris, would be fulfilled almost exactly as Polyphemus prayed it. Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and from that moment, Odysseus had the sea god as his enemy. Think about what that means. Odysseus needed to sail home. Sailing requires favorable seas, favorable winds, the absence of storms. All of these things were controlled by Poseidon. Odysseus had just made an enemy of the one god whose favor he absolutely needed. It was like a sailor today insulting the entire ocean and expecting to have a pleasant cruise. From that point on, every time Odysseus tried to sail toward home, Poseidon would intervene. Storms would blow his ships off course. Massive waves would appear from nowhere. Favorable winds would suddenly shift to unfavorable ones. Poseidon couldn't directly kill Odysseus. Other gods, particularly Athena, protected him, and fate had decreed he would eventually reach home. But Poseidon can make the journey as long and agonizing as possible. Odysseus and his remaining men were blown to the land of the Laestrygonians, another race of giants who destroyed all but one of Odysseus's 12 ships, killing most of his men. They reached the island of Circe, where some men were transformed into pigs, before Circe and Odysseus came to an understanding. They traveled to the edge of the world and descended into the underworld, where the prophet Tiresias warned Odysseus that Poseidon's wrath would be devastating and would only end if Odysseus completed a specific ritual of appeasement years in the future. They passed the sirens, whose song lured sailors to their deaths. They navigated between Scylla and Charybdis, a 6-headed monster and a massive whirlpool, both Poseidon's domain. They reached the island of the sun god Helios, where, despite Odysseus's warnings, his starving men killed and ate some of Helios's sacred cattle. Zeus punished this sacrilege by destroying Odysseus's last ship with a thunderbolt, killing all the remaining men. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to wreckage. He drifted for 9 days before washing up on the island of Ogygia, home to the nymph Calypso. She fell in love with Odysseus and kept him there for 7 years, offering him immortality if he would stay with her forever. Odysseus, desperately homesick, refused. He spent his days sitting on the beach, staring at the horizon, weeping for his lost home and family. Finally, Zeus intervened, sending Hermes to command Calypso to release Odysseus. She reluctantly gave him materials to build a raft and sent him on his way. For 17 days, Odysseus sailed on his crude raft, finally seeing land on the horizon, finally having hope that he might reach civilization again. But Poseidon, returning from a trip to Ethiopia, spotted Odysseus on his raft. The god's anger flared anew. After all this time, after all this suffering, Odysseus was still alive, still trying to get home. Poseidon raised his trident and smashed the sea, creating a massive storm. Waves as tall as mountains crashed over the raft. Winds from all directions tore at the makeshift vessel. The raft was smashed to pieces, and Odysseus was thrown into the churning water. The goddess Ino took pity on him and gave him her magic veil, which would keep him afloat. But Poseidon sent wave after wave crashing over him, dragging him under. rolling him in the surf, battering him against rocks. For 2 days and nights, Odysseus swam and struggled, keeping his head above water only through sheer determination and divine help. Finally, he reached the shore of Phaeacia, more dead than alive, and collapsed on the beach. The Phaeacians, a people beloved of the gods and skilled sailors themselves, treated Odysseus with hospitality. Their king, Alcinous, heard Odysseus' story and was moved by his suffering. The Phaeacians gave Odysseus a ship and crew to take him home to Ithaca. Finally, after 10 years, after losing all his men, after suffering more than perhaps any other Greek hero, Odysseus would reach home. But even this final journey wasn't without Poseidon's wrath. The Phaeacians delivered Odysseus to Ithaca while he slept, setting him gently ashore with generous gifts. When Poseidon saw this, he was furious that the Phaeacians had helped his enemy. As their ship sailed back toward Phaeacia, Poseidon turned it to stone and rooted it to the sea floor inside of Phaeacia's harbor. A warning to anyone who might think of helping those Poseidon had cursed. Odysseus's trials weren't over even after reaching Ithaca. His house was full of suitors trying to marry Penelope and claim his kingdom, assuming he was dead. But at least he was home on his own island, no longer at the mercy of Poseidon's sea. But Poseidon's curse wasn't finished yet. Remember Polyphemus's prayer that Odysseus would find trouble at home, and he did. Over 100 suitors had invaded his house, eating his food, drinking his wine, harassing his wife, plotting to kill his son. Odysseus had to fight a bloody battle in his own home to reclaim what was his, killing all the suitors in a night of violence and vengeance. And even after that, according to some prophecies, Odysseus's relationship with Poseidon required one final ritual of appeasement. The blind prophet Tiresias had told Odysseus in the underworld that he would need to travel inland, so far inland that people had never seen the sea and didn't know what an oar was. There, Odysseus was to plant an oar in the ground and perform a sacrifice to Poseidon. Only then would the god's anger finally be appeased. Some versions of the myth say Odysseus did this after reclaiming his kingdom, traveling deep into Epirus, until he found people who mistook his oar for a winnowing fan. There he made his sacrifice to Poseidon, and only then did the god finally forgive him for blinding Polyphemus all those years ago. Think about the symmetry of that. Odysseus blinded Polyphemus in a cave. For this, he suffered 10 years of wandering, lost all his companions, endured storms and monsters and shipwrecks, was separated from his wife and son for 20 years total, 10 years fighting at Troy, 10 years trying to get a home, found his home invaded and his family threatened, had to fight one more battle even after all his wandering, all because he couldn't resist shouting his name in pride after escaping from the Cyclops cave. The Odyssey is, among other things, a meditation on the price of hubris, excessive pride. Odysseus's cleverness saved him and his men from Polyphemus. But his pride, his need to take credit, his inability to escape quietly, brought down Poseidon's wrath upon him. And Poseidon, characteristically, pursued that vengeance for a decade, making Odysseus's life a living nightmare, even though the original offense was against Poseidon's son, not against Poseidon himself. This is Poseidon in his most implacable mood, a god who takes personal offense at any harm to what he considers his son, his cities, his dignity, who pursues vengeance with single-minded determination, who uses the full extent of his power to punish those who wrong him, who cannot be bought off or reasoned with, who holds grudges for decades. Odysseus, the second cleverest man at Troy, after Nestor, the man who won the war with his wooden horse trick, the favorite of Athena, goddess of wisdom, was brought to his knees by Poseidon's anger. All his cleverness couldn't save him from a god who controlled the sea and refused to forgive. The Odyssey stands as a cautionary tale about the consequences of offending Poseidon. The sea god's vengeance was methodical, sustained, and absolutely devastating. He couldn't kill Odysseus outright. Fate and other gods prevented that. But he could, and did, make Odysseus wish he were dead. He could destroy everything Odysseus valued except life itself. He could stretch what should have been a few weeks' journey into a decade of nightmare. And in the end, even after Odysseus reached home, even after he reclaimed his kingdom, he still had to perform one final act of submission to Poseidon, traveling deep inland to make sacrifice and appeasement, acknowledging the god's power and his own wrong. Only then would Poseidon be satisfied. Only then would the god's wrath be appeased. This is the god the ancient Greeks feared and worshipped. Poseidon, who could turn a hero's homecoming into a decade of suffering for one moment of prideful foolishness, who pursued vengeance across thousands of miles and multiple years, who used storms, monsters, and terrible luck to punish those who crossed him, who required not just victory, but submission, not just defeat, but acknowledgement, who was, in short, as relentless and inescapable as the sea itself. Relationships, romances, and monstrous offspring. If there's one area where Poseidon's behavior was remarkably similar to his brother Zeus, it was in his romantic pursuits and his staggering number of offspring. Like Zeus, Poseidon had an official wife, but numerous other consorts, goddesses, nymphs, mortal women, with whom he fathered an almost countless number of children. Unlike Zeus, whose affairs often resulted in gods and heroes, Poseidon's offspring had a distinctly more unusual quality. Many of his children were monsters, giants, or creatures with strange and terrifying attributes. This makes sense when you think about it. Poseidon was god of the sea, and the sea was understood to be full of mysterious, frightening creatures. Poseidon's official wife was Amphitrite, a Nereid, one of the 50 daughters of Nereus, an ancient sea god who predated the Olympians. The courtship between Poseidon and Amphitrite is interesting because it actually involved persuasion rather than force, which was unusual for Poseidon. According to myth, Poseidon saw Amphitrite dancing with her sisters, the Nereids, and immediately desired her. He pursued her, but Amphitrite, perhaps having heard about Poseidon's reputation, or simply not wanting to be married, fled. She hid herself away, according to different sources, either with the Titan Atlas in the far reaches of the ocean, or in some other remote location. Poseidon sent out searchers to find her. A dolphin, one of Poseidon's sacred animals, eventually located Amphitrite and spent time persuading her to accept Poseidon's proposal. What arguments the dolphin used, we don't know, but whatever was said convinced Amphitrite to return and marry the sea god. As a reward for this service, Poseidon placed the dolphin among the stars as the constellation Delphinus, ensuring it would be remembered forever. Amphitrite became Queen of the Sea, a role similar to Hera's as Queen of the Gods, but with a much different personality and relationship dynamic. Unlike Hera, who was notorious for her jealous rage against Zeus's many lovers and their children. Amphitrite seems to have been remarkably calm and accepting about Poseidon's extramarital affairs. In fact, we have very few myths of Amphitrite punishing anyone or expressing jealousy. The only notable exception is the story of Scylla. There are some versions where Amphitrite, jealous of the sea nymph Scylla, poisoned the pool where Scylla bathed, transforming her into a monster with 6 heads and 12 feet. But even this story is disputed, with other versions blaming Circe for Scylla's transformation. Generally speaking, Amphitrite seemed content to rule the seas alongside Poseidon, without worrying too much about where he spent his time, or with whom. This might reflect ancient Greek attitudes about male infidelity. It was expected, even normal, and wives were simply supposed to accept it. Or it might reflect something about Amphitrite's nature as a sea goddess. The sea is vast and contains multitudes, so perhaps the sea queen simply had a more expansive view of relationships than mountain-dwelling Hera. Poseidon and Amphitrite had several children together. Their most famous son was Triton, a merman, a creature with the upper body of a man and the lower body of a fish, like his mother's marine nature combined with his father's humanoid form. Triton became his father's herald and messenger, announcing Poseidon's presence or mood by blowing on a conch shell horn. When Triton blew his horn one way, the seas would calm. When he blew it another way, storms would rise. This conch shell trumpet became one of Triton's identifying attributes in Greek art. They also had several daughters, though these are less prominent in mythology. Different sources name different daughters, including Benthesicyme and Rhode, but these figures don't play major roles in the surviving myths. The real explosion of offspring comes from Poseidon's many affairs and encounters with other women, mortal, divine, and everything in between. Unlike Zeus, whose affairs generally produced heroes or deities who would join the Olympian order, Poseidon's affairs often produced monsters, giants, and creatures that challenged or threatened heroes. One of his most famous offspring was Polyphemus the Cyclops, whom we've already discussed in detail. Polyphemus's mother was Thusa, a sea nymph, which made him a child of both sea divinity and monstrous nature. Polyphemus was just one of several cyclopes sired by Poseidon. He seems to have had a particular affinity for producing these one-eyed giants. The hunter Orion was said to be Poseidon's son by Urieli, though different sources give different accounts of Orion's parentage. Orion became one of the greatest hunters in mythology, eventually being placed among the stars as the constellation that bears his name. Poseidon gave Orion the ability to walk on water, allowing him to traverse the seas as easily as land, a fitting gift from a sea god father to his hunter son. Theseus, the great Athenian hero, was also claimed as Poseidon's son, though Theseus's mortal father Aegeus also claimed paternity. In the ancient world, dual paternity wasn't seen as contradictory. Both the mortal father and the divine father could be real fathers, with the divine father providing the heroic essence, and the mortal father providing the social identity and legitimacy. Theseus used his claimed connection to Poseidon several times. In one famous story, King Minos of Crete challenged Theseus's divine paternity, and Theseus proved it by diving into the sea and retrieving a ring that Minos had thrown there. With Poseidon's help, this divine patronage helped establish Theseus as a legitimate hero and eventually king of Athens. though it's ironic that the son of Poseidon would rule the city that had chosen Athena over Poseidon as patron. Bellerophon, another famous hero, was also considered Poseidon's son. Bellerophon became famous for riding Pegasus, himself Poseidon's offspring sort of, and killing the Chimera. But Bellerophon's pride eventually led to his downfall. He tried to ride Pegasus up to Mount Olympus, presuming he could join the gods, and Zeus sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus, causing the horse to throw Bellerophon, who fell back to earth and spent the rest of his life wandering alone and crippled. Peleus and Neleus, twin brothers who became kings of Iolcus and Pylos respectively, were also Poseidon's sons by Tyro. Through them, Poseidon became ancestor to several royal families in Thessaly and Messenia, spreading his bloodline through the Greek aristocracy. But alongside these heroes and kings, Poseidon fathered numerous monsters and giants. The giant Antaeus, whom Heracles fought and defeated, was Poseidon's son by Gaia, Earth. Antaeus was invincible as long as he touched the ground, his mother. But Heracles defeated him by lifting him off the ground and crushing him in a bear hug. The giant Chrysaor, whose name means golden sword, emerged from Medusa's neck along with Pegasus when Perseus beheaded her. Chrysaor was fully grown and armed at birth, springing forth as a warrior. He would later father the three-bodied giant Geryon, whom Heracles fought during his labors. Speaking of Pegasus, this magnificent winged horse deserves special attention as one of Poseidon's most famous children, though his birth was unique. When Perseus beheaded Medusa, who was pregnant by Poseidon at the time of her death, both Chrysaor and Pegasus emerged from her severed neck. The beautiful white horse with great wings was immediately associated with divine power and heroism. Athena helped tame Pegasus with a golden bridle, and the horse was eventually given to Bellerophon for his quest against the Chimera. Later, after Bellerophon's fall, Pegasus was taken to Mount Olympus and became the carrier of Zeus's thunderbolts. The connection between Pegasus and Poseidon emphasizes again Poseidon's dual nature as god of both horses and seas. Pegasus combined the power and grace of horses with the ability to fly, transcending the limitations of earthbound horses, creating something that existed between the terrestrial and celestial realms, much as Poseidon existed between land and sea. One of Poseidon's most infamous romantic pursuits involved Medusa, the mortal woman who would become a Gorgon. The story, as told by Ovid, is deeply troubling by modern standards. Medusa was a beautiful young woman and a priestess of Athena, serving in the goddess's temple. Poseidon saw her, desired her, and raped her in Athena's temple itself. A double violation, both of Medusa's person and of Athena's sacred space. Athena, enraged by this desecration, took out her fury not on her powerful uncle Poseidon, whom she couldn't punish, but on Medusa herself. The goddess transformed Medusa into a monster. Her beautiful hair became writhing snakes. Her lovely face became hideous, and anyone who looked directly at her would turn to stone. Medusa was essentially punished for being a victim, which reveals some harsh truths about gender, power, and justice in Greek mythology. Poseidon's behavior in this story is characteristic of how he's often portrayed in myths involving women. He sees, he desires, he takes, often by force, often without regard for the woman's wishes or the consequences for her. This pattern appears repeatedly. He pursued Demeter, who fled from him by transforming into a mare, so he became a stallion and caught her anyway. He pursued various nymphs, often taking them by force or deception. He was accused of raping Canis, a mortal woman, and then transforming her into a man named Canos at her request, as if physical transformation could somehow make up for or erase the violation. This behavior wasn't unique to Poseidon. Zeus was even worse, with countless rapes and deceptions attributed to him. But it reveals something important about ancient Greek attitudes toward divine power and female consent. The gods took what they wanted. Mortal women and even goddesses had limited ability to refuse. The power imbalance was so extreme that the concept of consent becomes almost meaningless. And the myths often reflect this reality with casual acceptance, noting these unions as facts without moral judgment, or sometimes even framing them as honors, as if being raped by a god was something to be proud of because it elevated the victim's social status. From a modern perspective, these stories are horrifying. From an ancient Greek perspective, they reflected the reality of power. Those with power used it, often in ways that harmed those without power, and the victims simply had to endure and make the best of their situations. The myths encoded these power dynamics and perhaps served, in some ways, as warnings to young women about the dangers they faced. Poseidon also had children with some unusual beings. With Gaia, the earth herself, he fathered several giants, including Antaeus. The union of sea and earth producing giants makes symbolic sense. The meeting of these two fundamental elements creates beings of tremendous size and power. The breadth and variety of Poseidon's offspring reveals something important about his nature. He was prolific, powerful, and didn't limit himself to any particular type of partner or any particular type of offspring. Heroes, monsters, kings, giants, all emerged from Poseidon's various unions. This reflects the ancient Greek understanding of the sea as containing enormous diversity, as being the source of both wonderful and terrible things, as being fundamentally unpredictable in what it might produce or wash up on shore. Unlike Hades, who had basically one wife and few, if any, children, Poseidon was actively engaged with the world, constantly having new relationships, producing new offspring who would then enter into the mythological narrative and interact with other gods and heroes. This abundance of children gave Poseidon connections throughout the Greek world, royal families claiming descent from him, heroes calling on him as father, monsters that had to be fought being his offspring. He was woven into the fabric of Greek mythology through these many family connections. But this also meant Poseidon had a lot of children who could be hurt, offended, or killed, giving him many opportunities for the kind of protective vengeance we saw with Polyphemus. When you have that many children, especially children who are often themselves violent or dangerous, it's likely that some of them will eventually be harmed or killed, usually by heroes on quests. And Poseidon, as we've seen, took such offenses personally and responded with terrible fury. The contrast between Amphitrite's acceptance and Hera's jealousy is worth noting one more time. Hera made Zeus's lovers and children suffer terribly. She pursued Leto across the world. When Leto was pregnant with Apollo and Artemis, she drove Heracles mad, causing him to kill his own family. She tormented Io, transforming her into a cow, and sending a gadfly to sting her continuously. Hera's jealousy was legendary and terrible, but Amphitrite, We have almost no stories of her tormenting Poseidon's other women or their children. This might be because she was simply a less developed character in mythology, the sea queen who stayed in the palace while Poseidon roamed. Or it might reflect different power dynamics. Hera was Zeus's equal in many ways, powerful enough to challenge him, though never successfully, whereas Amphitrite might have had less power relative to Poseidon. Or it might simply reflect different personalities. Some people respond to betrayal with fury, others with acceptance or resignation. Whatever the reason, Poseidon's domestic life, if we can call it that, seemed less fraught than Zeus's, even though his behavior was arguably just as bad or worse. He fathered children everywhere, with everyone producing a family tree so complex and extensive that tracking all of Poseidon's offspring would require volumes. But unlike Zeus's household, there wasn't constant divine warfare between wife and husband over these indiscretions. This vast progeny, spreading across the Greek world in the form of heroes, monsters, kings, and creatures, ensured that Poseidon's influence extended far beyond his oceanic domain. Through his children, he was connected to royal families, to heroic quests, to regional mythologies across Greece. The sea god's bloodline ran through human civilization, like rivers running to the ocean, always ultimately connecting back to him, the source, the father, the god who had been with so many and had produced so much for better and often for worse. Power on Olympus, respect, rivalry, and rebellion. We've explored Poseidon's domain, the seas, the earthquakes, the horses, and we've seen his personal relationships and his grudges against mortals. But what was Poseidon's position among the gods themselves? How did the other Olympians view him? What was his relationship with Zeus? And how did his tremendous power translate into influence and respect on Mount Olympus? The answer is complicated. Poseidon was undeniably one of the three most powerful gods. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades formed a triumvirate that had overthrown the Titans and divided the cosmos between them. In terms of raw power, Poseidon was second only to Zeus. He commanded vast domains, all the world's oceans, seas, lakes, and rivers, plus the ability to cause earthquakes. He could destroy fleets, flood cities, shake the earth itself. His power was immense and undeniable, but power doesn't automatically translate into political influence or respect, especially when you have a younger brother who claims to be king and who wields a weapon, the thunderbolt, that can kill even immortals. The relationship between Zeus and Poseidon was defined by this tension. Poseidon was older and arguably just as deserving of rule, but Zeus had become king, whether through the accident of drawing lots or through his role as the one who had saved his siblings and led the Titanomachy. In Homer's Iliad, there's a revealing exchange that shows this tension perfectly. Zeus sends his messenger Iris to command Poseidon to stop helping the Greeks and withdraw from the battlefield of Troy. Zeus frames this as an order from the king of the gods to a subordinate. Poseidon's response is immediate and angry. He essentially argues that he and Zeus are equals in honor and dignity, that they divided the world by equal lot as brothers, that Zeus has no right to command him as if he were a lesser god or a servant. He acknowledges that Zeus is more powerful. Zeus has the thunderbolt, after all, the ultimate weapon. But Poseidon clearly resents the implication that Zeus has authority over him. This exchange reveals the core dynamic between them. Zeus claims kingship and expects obedience. Poseidon acknowledges Zeus is more powerful, but resents being treated as subordinate. Both are careful not to push it too far, because neither wants actual warfare between them. They're brothers who have tensions, but who also fought together and who ultimately need to maintain the cosmic order they established. Poseidon's resentment of Zeus's authority manifested in various ways throughout Greek mythology. At one point, according to the Iliad, Poseidon joined a conspiracy with Hera and Athena to overthrow Zeus. The exact details of this plot aren't fully explained in Homer, but the basic story is that these three gods, tired of Zeus's overbearing behavior, decided to bind him with chains while he slept. The plot very nearly succeeded. They managed to bind Zeus, but then started arguing about what to do next. Who would rule, how power would be divided, what the next steps should be. While they were arguing, the sea nymph Thetis, who was grateful to Zeus for past kindness, summoned one of the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed giants who had helped fight the Titans. This being quickly untied all the chain's many knots, freeing Zeus before the conspiring gods could finalize their coup. Zeus, once free, was furious. He punished Hera severely, hanging her from the sky with golden chains, and he punished Poseidon and Apollo by sending them to serve the mortal king Laomedon, which led to the whole mess with Troy's walls that we discussed earlier. This episode shows that Poseidon was willing to actively move against Zeus when the opportunity arose, that he could gather allies among the other Olympians, but also that such conspiracies were extremely dangerous and likely to fail. After this failed rebellion, Poseidon was more careful about directly challenging Zeus, but the resentment remained. Throughout the Trojan War, Poseidon repeatedly pushed the boundaries of what Zeus would allow. When Zeus favored the Trojans, Poseidon helped the Greeks. When Zeus forbade the gods from interfering, Poseidon found ways to interpret that order narrowly, or to wait until Zeus was distracted before acting. He never quite crossed the line into open defiance, but he was constantly pushing against Zeus's authority, asserting his own will and power wherever he could. Part of this tension came from Poseidon's personality. He was, as we've seen repeatedly, proud, easily offended, temperamental, and unwilling to accept subordination. The idea that his younger brother, Zeus, was youngest of the siblings, could order him around was galling. The fact that Zeus wielded more direct power was frustrating, and the reality that Zeus got the sky, which included Mount Olympus, and thus the social center of divine life, while Poseidon got the seas, which were powerful but remote, probably contributed to Poseidon's resentment. But Poseidon also understood reality. Zeus was more powerful. Zeus had allies among the other gods. Zeus had established himself as king, and overturning that would require a war that might destroy everything they'd built. So Poseidon grumbled, complained, pushed boundaries, but ultimately usually fell in line when Zeus really put his foot down. With the other Olympians, Poseidon's relationships were mixed. We've already discussed his rivalry with Athena over Athens and their generally antagonistic relationship. With Hera, there seems to have been mutual respect despite the failed conspiracy. Both were powerful. Both often disagreed with Zeus. Both had their own spheres of influence that Zeus couldn't fully control. With Apollo, Poseidon had shared the punishment of serving Laomedon and being cheated, which created a certain bond, though they ended up on opposite sides during the Trojan War. With Artemis, Aphrodite, Ares, Hermes, Hephaestus, and the other Olympians, Poseidon seems to have had generally cordial, but not particularly close relationships. He was part of the Olympian family, attended councils and festivals, but he wasn't central to Olympian politics or social life the way Zeus, Hera, or Athena were. Part of this was probably by choice. Poseidon had his own palace beneath the sea, near Aegae in Euboea. He spent considerable time there in his own domain, surrounded by sea creatures and nymphs, and the vastness of the ocean. When he did come to Olympus, it was often for official business or specific events rather than to socialize. He seems to have been more of an outsider by temperament, perhaps similar to Hades, but not as extreme. Poseidon at least showed up for council meetings and involved himself in divine affairs, whereas Hades almost never left the underworld. The respect Poseidon commanded among the gods came not from political maneuvering or social connections, but from fear and recognition of his power. Everyone knew that Poseidon could cause earthquakes that would shake Olympus itself. Everyone knew he controlled the seas that mortals depended on. Everyone knew he had a temper and held grudges. The other gods gave Poseidon his due, not because they particularly liked him, but because offending him was dangerous. This is actually how mortals related to Poseidon too. Worship based on fear and practical need, rather than love or moral admiration. You honored Poseidon because you needed safe seas, because you feared earthquakes, because not honoring him was asking for disaster. Similarly, the gods treated Poseidon with respect, because not doing so might trigger his rage, and while he couldn't match Zeus in direct conflict, he could make life miserable for anyone who crossed him. Poseidon's temperament, proud, resentful, powerful, easily offended, meant that he was never quite satisfied with his position, despite its obvious advantages. He was one of the three rulers of the cosmos, commanded vast realms, was worshipped throughout the Greek world, but he still felt somehow subordinated to Zeus, still resented his younger brother's kingship, still chafed at having to follow orders or defer to anyone. That made him a somewhat unstable element in the Olympian order. Zeus could generally rely on Apollo, Artemis, Athena, and others to support his rule, or at least not actively undermine it. But Poseidon? Poseidon was always a question mark. Would he follow orders this time or push back? Would he accept Zeus's decision or find ways to work around it? Would he support the cosmic order or let his personal grudges and resentments lead him to make trouble? The answer usually depended on Poseidon's mood, which, like the sea, was changeable and unpredictable. Sometimes he was cooperative and reasonable. Other times he was aggressive and contentious. The other gods, particularly Zeus, had to manage this carefully, treating Poseidon with appropriate respect, not pushing him too far, making concessions when necessary to keep him relatively satisfied. In councils of the gods, Poseidon's voice carried weight. When he spoke, others listened, not just because of his power, but because he often had legitimate points to make. He was ancient, had helped establish the Olympian order, had immense experience, and ruled a vast domain. His perspectives on conflicts, particularly those involving the sea or coastal cities, were valuable, but his opinions also had to be balanced against his known grudges and biases. If Poseidon strongly advocated for a particular course of action, other gods would wonder, is he suggesting this because it's right, or because he has some personal stake or grudge involved? His known vindictiveness and tendency to hold grudges made his motives always somewhat suspect. This combination, tremendous power, significant authority, respect born from fear, personal resentments, unpredictable temperament, and grudge-holding nature, made Poseidon one of the most complex figures in the Olympian hierarchy. He was essential to the cosmic order, commanded respect and fear, had significant influence, but was never quite the central figure he perhaps felt he deserved to be. He was powerful, but perpetually somewhat dissatisfied, respected, but not beloved, feared, but not fully trusted. In a way, Poseidon embodied the tension between raw power and political authority, between deserving respect and actually receiving it, between being theoretically equal and practically subordinate. He was Zeus's brother, his equal in birth and dignity, but he lived in Zeus's world, under Zeus's ultimate authority, and that subordination, however minimal, however much Zeus tried to show respect, clearly grated on Poseidon throughout mythological history. This is the god who sat in Olympian councils, powerful, proud, resentful, respected, feared, never quite satisfied, always somewhat apart, capable of both essential cooperation and dangerous opposition, as unpredictable in politics as the sea was in weather, as liable to help as to hinder, depending on his mood and his grievances. Poseidon on Olympus was a force that had to be managed, respected, appeased, and never, ever underestimated, much like Poseidon everywhere else. Worship, temples, and enduring legacy. To truly understand Poseidon's importance in ancient Greek culture, we need to look beyond the myths and examine how he was actually worshipped, where his temple stood, what festivals celebrated him, and how his influence shaped Greek civilization in practical, tangible ways. Because Poseidon wasn't just a character in stories, he was a religious reality, a force that Greeks honored, feared, and tried to keep favorable through constant ritual and worship. The most famous sanctuary dedicated to Poseidon that survives today is the Temple of Poseidon at Cape Sunion, located on a dramatic promontory overlooking the Aegean Sea, about 43 miles southeast of Athens. This temple, built around 440 BCE, perched on cliffs more than 200 feet above the sea, was one of the most significant landmarks for ancient sailors. When ships approached Athens from the south, the gleaming white marble columns of the temple would be visible from miles away, signaling that travelers were nearing Athenian waters. The temple's location was perfectly chosen, sailors having survived the dangerous open waters of the Aegean would see Poseidon's temple and offer prayers of thanks for safe passage. Those setting out would stop at Cape Sunion to make sacrifices, hoping to secure the god's favor for their journey. The temple thus served both religious and practical purposes. It was a place of worship and a navigational landmark. The temple itself was magnificent, built in the Doric order with marble from the local quarries at Agraleza. It had 34 columns originally, of which 16 still stand today. The proportions were carefully calculated to account for the optical effects of viewing the temple from below and from the sea. Inside was a massive statue of Poseidon, probably similar to the famous statue that once stood in the Parthenon, showing the god with his trident, commanding and powerful. We know from ancient sources that major festivals were celebrated at Sunyan, including races with boats called triremes. Imagine competitive boat races held in honor of the sea god, with the winners receiving prizes and glory, their victory understood as having been blessed by Poseidon himself. The combination of sport, religion, and maritime skill perfectly embodied Greek values and Poseidon's domains. But Cape Sunion was just one of many temples dedicated to Poseidon throughout the Greek world. Another major site was the sanctuary near Corinth, home to the Isthmian Games. Corinth's location on the narrow isthmus connecting mainland Greece to the Peloponnese made it a crucial point for both land and sea travel. Ships traveling between the eastern and western Mediterranean often had their cargoes transferred across this isthmus, rather than sailing the dangerous route around the southern tip of the Peloponnese. Control of this isthmus meant control of trade and military movement. The sanctuary of Poseidon at Isthmia, located on the isthmus, was thus economically and strategically important, as well as religiously significant. The Isthmian Games, held every 2 years, were one of the 4 major Panhellenic festivals, along with the Olympic, Pythian, and Nemean Games. These were not just athletic competitions, but religious celebrations, grand festivals that brought together Greeks from throughout the Mediterranean world. The Isthmian Games included chariot racing, which was fitting for the god of horses. They included athletic competitions, musical contests, and probably naval races as well, given Poseidon's maritime associations. Winners were crowned with wreaths of wild celery, or, in earlier periods, pine wreaths, both plants sacred to Poseidon. Victory at the Isthmian Games brought glory and fame, and winners were understood to have been blessed by Poseidon himself. These games also had political significance. During the games, a sacred truce was observed, just as during the Olympics. This allowed people to travel safely to and from the festival. The games provided opportunities for cities to showcase their wealth and power through the quality of their athletes and the splendor of their offerings to Poseidon. Diplomatic negotiations could occur during the festival period. The games were, in essence, a combination of religious festival, athletic competition, cultural celebration, and political gathering, all centered on honoring Poseidon. Other notable temples to Poseidon existed throughout Greece and the Greek colonies. In Onchestus in Boeotia, one of the oldest festivals to Poseidon was celebrated, featuring horse racing, reflecting the earlier traditions of Poseidon as horse god. In Pylos, linear bead tablets from the Bronze Age show that Poseidon was perhaps the most important god, predating even Zeus in that region's worship. His title there was Wa Naka, meaning lord or king, and he seems to have had chthonic underworld associations, connecting him to earth and horses rather than just the sea. This variation in how Poseidon was worshipped across different regions and time periods reflects the complexity of his cult. In coastal areas, he was primarily the sea god, sailors' prayers, fishermen's offerings, naval powers patron. In inland areas, particularly in Arcadia and Thessaly, he was more associated with horses, with springs, with earth and fertility. These different aspects weren't contradictory, but rather showed the multiple facets of this ancient and powerful deity. Sacrifices to Poseidon typically involved bulls, horses, or both. Bulls were sacred to Poseidon, black bulls often preferred, matching the dark depths of the sea. The sacrifice of horses, while expensive, was considered especially pleasing to the horse god. Some festivals involved driving horses or bulls into the sea to drown, essentially returning them to Poseidon's domain. Other rituals involved pouring libations, wine, oil, or other offerings directly into the sea, letting them sink to Poseidon's realm beneath the waves. Before sea voyages, sailors would perform rituals to ensure Poseidon's favor. They might sacrifice a black ram at the shore, its blood running into the waves. They might pour libation from their ship while uttering prayers. During storms, desperate sailors would promise elaborate sacrifices and dedications if Poseidon would spare them. Votive offerings that, if the sailors survived, would later be displayed in temples as thanks for the god's mercy. These votive offerings tell us a lot about how ordinary people related to Poseidon. Archaeological excavations at Poseidon's temples have uncovered countless dedications. Small model boats, fishing equipment, weapons, jewelry, coins, each represents a story. A merchant whose cargo arrived safely, a fisherman who survived the storm, a naval commander whose fleet won a battle, a coastal community that survived a tsunami or earthquake. These weren't wealthy aristocrats making grand gestures, but ordinary people thanking Poseidon for their survival or their prosperity. The ubiquity of Poseidon worship across the Greek world shows just how central he was to ancient Greek life. This wasn't like worshiping a god of wine or love or wisdom, things that were important but not immediately necessary for survival. Poseidon controlled forces that could kill you, that you encountered constantly if you lived anywhere near the coast, which most Greeks did, that your economy depended on, that your very survival required respecting. In times of earthquake, cities would immediately perform purification rituals and additional sacrifices to Poseidon, trying to appease his anger. If a coastal city was struck by a tsunami or flooding, surviving residents would commission new dedications to Poseidon or restore his temples, hoping to prevent future disasters. The practical, survival-oriented nature of Poseidon worship meant it was constant, widespread, and deeply embedded in daily life. This worship continued well into the Roman period, though with some changes. The Romans identified Poseidon with their own sea god Neptune, and while the character and mythology evolved somewhat, the basic veneration of the sea god continued. Temples to Neptune were built throughout the Roman Empire. Sailors in the Roman Navy honored Neptune before voyages. Coastal colonies featured Neptune prominently in their religious life. Even after Christianity became dominant in the Mediterranean world, Poseidon's Neptune didn't entirely disappear from cultural memory. The god was too deeply embedded, too associated with the sea itself. Sailors in medieval and Renaissance times still sometimes invoked Neptune's name, often Christianizing it, but maintaining the association between the god and the sea. In art and literature, Neptune chalk Poseidon remained a symbol of the sea's power. Everything from Baroque fountains showing Neptune with his trident to modern company logos and sports team mascots. The persistence of Poseidon draws Neptune in cultural memory, reflects the god's fundamental connection to something permanent and unchanging, the sea itself. Other gods could be forgotten as their specific cults died out, but as long as humans sailed on the ocean, the association between the sea and a powerful, temperamental deity remained psychologically resonant. Poseidon might not be worshipped anymore, but The sea is still unpredictable, still powerful, still capable of destroying or sustaining, still requiring respect and care from those who venture upon it. In modern times, Poseidon appears in everything from Percy Jackson novels, where he's portrayed as moody but ultimately caring, especially toward his son Percy, to video games, movies, and other media. The characterization varies. Sometimes he's a villain, sometimes an ally, sometimes just a powerful force. But the core associations remain: the sea, the trident, horses, earthquakes, power, and temperament. The scientific submarine research vessel Poseidon, cities named Poseidonia, later Paestum. In ancient times, the constellation Delphinus, the dolphin Poseidon rewarded. Naval equipment and vessels named after him. Poseidon's name and associations permeate our culture even now. 3,000 years after his worship peaked in ancient Greece. Perhaps most importantly, Poseidon represents something timeless: humanity's relationship with the ocean. The ancient Greeks didn't understand plate tectonics or weather systems or ocean currents, but they understood that the sea was powerful, necessary, and dangerous. They understood that you could follow all the rules, make all the right preparations, and still be destroyed by a sudden storm. They understood that the earth beneath your feet, despite feeling solid, could suddenly shake and crack. These understandings are still valid. The sea is still powerful and dangerous. Earthquakes still strike without warning. Tsunamis still devastate coastal regions. Our scientific understanding of the mechanisms has changed, but the fundamental reality hasn't. Humans are small and fragile in the face of natural forces that dwarf us in scale and power. Poseidon, the Earthshaker, the Lord of the Seas, embodied this reality. He wasn't a comforting god or a purely benevolent one. He was a representation of power that humans needed but couldn't control, of forces that could help or harm but couldn't be predicted or fully understood. Worshipping Poseidon was an acknowledgement of human vulnerability and dependence, an attempt to establish relationship with forces beyond human control, a way of saying, "We respect you, we honor you, please be gentle with us." That relationship between humanity and the uncontrollable forces of nature hasn't ended. We don't sacrifice bulls to Poseidon anymore, but we still build sea walls, develop tsunami warning systems, study seismology, and treat the ocean with a mixture of reverence and fear. The names have changed, but the underlying dynamic remains. We depend on the sea, we are threatened by it, we must respect it, and we can never fully control it. Poseidon lives on, not as a literal deity receiving sacrifices, but as a symbol, an archetype, a representation of that eternal relationship between humanity and the powerful, unpredictable forces that shaped our world and continue to shape it today. Conclusion: the trembling ruler's enduring power as we emerge from our deep dive into Poseidon's mythology. Let's reflect on what we've learned about this complex, powerful, and endlessly fascinating god. Poseidon was never simple or one-dimensional. He was the god of the sea, yes, but also the Earthshaker whose earthquakes terrified the ancient Greeks. He was the creator of horses, creatures that combined grace and power, tamability and wildness. Much like Poseidon himself, he was a competitor who built the walls of Troy, a lover who produced countless offspring both heroic and monstrous, a brother who both respected and resented Zeus's authority, a vengeful god who pursued Odysseus for 10 years over a single moment of hubris. What emerges from all these stories is a portrait of a deity defined by extremes and contradictions. Poseidon could be generous, creating horses and springs, helping heroes, supporting cities. He could also be devastatingly vengeful, pursuing grudges across decades, destroying those who offended him with storms and earthquakes and sea monsters. He could be a cooperative member of the Olympian family, attending councils and following cosmic order. He could also be rebellious, conspiring against Zeus, pushing boundaries, asserting his independence. These contradictions made Poseidon feel real to the ancient Greeks in ways that more consistent gods might not have. The sea is contradictory, beautiful and terrifying, calm and violent, sustaining and destroying, often within the same day or even the same hour. A god who embodied that contradiction, who could be both helpful and harmful, both reasonable and irrational, both predictable and wildly unpredictable, matched the Greeks' lived experience of the forces that shaped their world. For modern audiences, Poseidon offers something different from the usual heroic narratives. He's not an uncomplicated hero fighting evil. He's not a pure villain to be defeated. He's a force, sometimes aligned with human interests, sometimes opposed to them, but always pursuing his own agenda, always responding to slights and honors, always commanding respect through power rather than requesting it through virtue. The lessons from Poseidon's myths are still relevant. Power without temperance is dangerous. Grudges maintained for too long poison everything. Pride can turn victory into disaster. Respecting forces greater than yourself isn't weakness, but wisdom. The same power that creates can destroy. What you most depend on can most easily harm you. The ancient Greeks understood all this instinctively. They lived it every day. When they looked at the sea, they saw Poseidon's moods. When the earth shook, they felt his anger. When horses galloped, they saw his gift to humanity. The god was everywhere in their experience, written into the landscape and the rhythms of their lives. We've lost that direct connection, but we haven't lost the realities that Poseidon represented. The ocean is still vast and powerful. Earthquakes still strike without warning. Natural forces still dwarf human power and ingenuity. We've just learned to describe these realities in different language, scientific rather than mythological, mechanistic rather than personal. But perhaps there's value in returning occasionally to the mythological language, to seeing the ocean not just as water in motion, but as something with a personality and agency, to understanding earthquakes not just as tectonic shifts, but as expressions of tremendous power that human civilization exists at the mercy of. Not literally believing in gods, perhaps, but using mythological thinking to reconnect with a sense of humility and appropriate fear in the face of forces we can understand but never fully control. Poseidon, the trembling ruler, shaking the earth and stirring the seas, demanding respect and worship and proper honor, pursuing vengeance against those who wronged him, creating wonders and horrors in equal measure. This god captured something essential about power, nature, and the human condition. His myths continue to resonate because the realities they describe haven't changed. The sea is still dangerous. The earth still shakes. Power is still unpredictable. And humanity still navigates between respecting forces greater than itself and daring to voyage across them anyway. If you've enjoyed this exploration of Poseidon and his myths, his powers and his passions, his rage and his creativity, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. There are countless more stories to tell from Greek mythology, tales of gods and heroes, monsters and magic, love and war, creation and destruction. We'll continue exploring these ancient narratives, finding the timeless truths within them, discovering what they can still teach us about ourselves and our world. Until next time, may your voyages be safe, may the earth stay steady beneath your feet, and may you never find yourself on the wrong side of Poseidon's temper. Sleep well, dear listener. The waves will keep rolling, and the stories will keep flowing, as eternal as the sea itself.